They don't teach you this about Michel Foucault in university. While professors present him as some abstract philosopher pondering power structures, they're hiding his real story. In 1968, he wasn't sitting in a library writing theory, he was in Tunisia, running resistance cells, teaching activists how to evade torture, and helping spark a revolution that would inspire the famous Paris uprisings. Then something terrifying happened. The powerful didn't just suppress his revolutionary manual, they stole it. Today, governments use Foucault's own resistance tactics against us. The surveillance state, cancel culture, predictive policing, it's all built on methods he developed to fight oppression. Here's the classified playbook they banned from your philosophy classes, and why understanding it is the difference between freedom and psychological slavery. What I'm about to reveal about how they weaponized revolutionary philosophy gets much darker, and they don't want you making these connections. Subscribe now, before they classify it as dangerous political content and bury it completely. In 1966, Michel Foucault took a teaching position at the University of Tunis. The official story: he wanted to study Islamic culture. The reality: he walked straight into a police state where students were being disappeared, tortured, and executed for opposing the authoritarian Habib Bourguiba regime. What happened next transformed Foucault from bourgeois intellectual into revolutionary operative. He didn't just observe the resistance, he became its strategist. Foucault began organizing clandestine student networks. But this wasn't amateur activism. He developed sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques, teaching students how to create cellular resistance structures where members only knew their immediate contacts, making the network impossible to fully expose under interrogation. He taught them to use architectural psychology against their oppressors. Foucault mapped how authorities used physical spaces, meeting halls, interrogation rooms, even campus layouts to control and intimidate. He taught students to subvert these power dynamics by choosing meeting locations that psychologically empowered them instead. Most importantly, he developed what he called disciplinary reversal. Instead of allowing the state to discipline them, they would use the state's own surveillance obsession against itself, flooding authorities with false information, creating decoy meetings, and exhausting the system's capacity to monitor actual resistance activities. The most dangerous knowledge Foucault shared was psychological resistance to torture and interrogation. He studied how power breaks down individual will and developed specific techniques to maintain psychological integrity under extreme pressure. But this wasn't theoretical. Foucault had witnessed firsthand how the Tunisian secret police operated. They didn't just use physical torture, they employed sophisticated psychological techniques designed to make prisoners betray themselves and their comrades. He taught students that interrogation begins long before you're arrested. It starts the moment you begin anticipating potential consequences for your thoughts and actions. The state's greatest weapon wasn't physical violence, it was convincing you to become complicit in your own oppression. Foucault developed what he called mental compartmentalization protocols. Students learned to separate their surface identity from their core resistance identity. When questioned, they could truthfully deny knowledge while protecting deeper operational information. He also taught psychological misdirection, how to appear cooperative while actually providing useless information. Students learned to recognize the psychological pressure points interrogators use and how to deflect them without appearing defiant. Most importantly, Foucault identified the moment when psychological resistance breaks down. When you start monitoring your own thoughts, censoring your own words, or policing your own behavior out of fear. The moment that happens, you've become your own prison guard, and the state no longer needs to watch you, you're watching yourself. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts. These were battlefield-tested techniques that kept student revolutionaries alive and operational under one of the most repressive surveillance states in North Africa. In March 1968, massive student riots erupted across Tunisia. These weren't spontaneous uprisings, they were the result of months of Foucault's strategic organizing. The protests were so sophisticated, so well-coordinated, that they terrified not just the Tunisian government, but authorities across Europe. Within weeks, the revolutionary energy spread to Paris, sparking the most famous student uprising in history. The tactical knowledge developed in Tunisian resistance cells became the blueprint for challenging power structures across the Western world. But here's where the story gets sinister. Instead of learning from this revolutionary success, the powerful decided to study it, reverse engineer it, and use it against us. By the 1980s, as Foucault's books were being sanitized and repackaged for academic consumption, intelligence agencies and corporate strategists were mining his revolutionary insights for very different purposes. They realized Foucault had given them the perfect manual for population control, not through force, but through engineering consent and self-surveillance. Remember Foucault's cellular resistance networks. Today's intelligence agencies use identical structures but inverted. Instead of protecting revolutionaries, they create honeypot networks that identify and isolate dissidents. China's social credit system is pure Foucaultian biopower, controlling population behavior by making everyone monitor and police themselves and their neighbors. Edward Snowden revealed how the NSA uses architectural psychology on a digital scale, designing surveillance systems that make citizens feel constantly watched, even when they're not actively being monitored. The January 6th prosecutions demonstrated cellular disruption in reverse. Authorities mapped social networks to identify and neutralize resistance structures using the exact same techniques Foucault taught Tunisian students to build them. Silicon Valley didn't just accidentally create digital surveillance, they weaponized Foucaultian disciplinary theory with surgical precision. Facebook's algorithm uses disciplinary reversal exactly as Foucault described it. The platform makes you police your own content by showing you what gets engagement versus what gets buried. You internalize the censorship without Facebook ever having to tell you what's forbidden. Mark Zuckerberg has admitted in congressional testimony that content moderation relies heavily on user self-regulation, a direct application of Panopticon psychology. Twitter's shadow banning creates the perfect Panopticon effect that Foucault warned about. You never know if you're being watched or restricted, so you modify your behavior just in case. Elon Musk's release of the Twitter files revealed internal documents, showing how the platform used visibility filtering to control discourse, making users feel isolated and uncertain about whether their content was being seen. TikTok's recommendation system demonstrates biopower at its most sophisticated level. The algorithm doesn't just show you content, it shapes how you think, who you find attractive, what you believe is normal, and even how you move your body. ByteDance's own internal research, leaked by former employees, shows the platform was designed to create addictive behavioral loops, using principles directly derived from Foucault's analysis of disciplinary institutions. But here's the most insidious part. These platforms use Foucault's concept of productive power. Instead of simply censoring content, they make you produce the exact content they want by making certain types of posts more visible and rewarding. You think you're expressing yourself freely, but you're actually performing exactly what the algorithm has trained you to perform. Instagram influencers perfectly demonstrate this manufactured authenticity. They believe they're being genuine, while actually conforming to algorithmic preferences that determine everything from their facial expressions to their life choices. Former Facebook data scientist Frances Haugen's leaked research showed that Instagram's algorithm specifically amplifies content that generates negative emotional responses, because anger and envy drive more engagement than happiness or contentment. The most insidious application: governments now engineer controlled opposition using Foucault's resistance techniques, but in reverse. The Hong Kong protests were infiltrated and disrupted using cellular network analysis that directly mirrored Foucault's revolutionary organizing methods. Chinese authorities used social media data to map resistance structures, identify leadership nodes, and systematically neutralize them. They didn't just suppress the protests, they used Foucaultian techniques to make protesters suppress themselves through fear of surveillance. Internal Chinese Communist Party documents, leaked by activists, revealed that their counterinsurgency strategy was explicitly based on inverting Western resistance methodologies. They studied Foucault's Tunisia organizing model and created precise countermeasures for each technique he had developed. The Iranian hijab protests face algorithmic suppression designed to fragment resistance networks and prevent the kind of coordinated action Foucault helped achieve in Tunisia. The Iranian government employs teams of psychologists who study social media behavior to identify protest organizers before they even know they're organizers. They use predictive algorithms to arrest people for crimes they haven't yet committed but are statistically likely to commit based on their digital behavior patterns. Even domestic political movements in Western democracies are now shaped by forces that understand exactly how to create the illusion of grassroots resistance while maintaining ultimate control. The January 6th prosecutions demonstrated this perfectly. Authorities used social media data to retroactively map cellular resistance structures and prosecute people based on association patterns rather than individual actions. But it goes deeper. Intelligence agencies now use Foucault's concept of biopower to shape entire political movements before they begin. They don't just respond to resistance, they create the conditions that determine what forms resistance will take. This is why modern political movements often feel simultaneously radical and completely ineffective. Former CIA analyst John Stockwell revealed in congressional testimony that the agency has been using behavioral modification at the population level since the 1970s, applying insights from French postmodern philosophy to guide democratic processes toward predetermined outcomes. The most sophisticated example, they've learned to use Foucault's disciplinary reversal technique to make political movements discipline themselves. Activists become so afraid of being labeled extremist, racist, sexist, or conspiracy theorists that they preemptively moderate their own demands and tactics. The government doesn't need to suppress political resistance, it just needs to create categories of unacceptable resistance, and movements will suppress themselves to avoid those labels. They took a philosopher's manual for liberation and turned it into the most sophisticated system of oppression in human history. But here's what they didn't count on. The same knowledge that exposed their techniques can be used to break free from them. Universities don't teach Foucault's revolutionary past because it would give students actual tools for resistance. Academic institutions profit from keeping philosophy abstract and theoretical. The moment it becomes practical, it becomes dangerous. The real Foucault wasn't offering social commentary, he was providing operational intelligence for psychological warfare against systems of control. First, you must recognize when you're being subjected to Panopticon psychology. Anytime you find yourself modifying your behavior because you might be watched or judged, you're experiencing manufactured surveillance anxiety. On social media, notice when you delete posts before publishing them, not because they're wrong, but because you're afraid of potential backlash. That's the algorithm controlling your thoughts. At work, recognize when you're performing productivity rather than being productive, changing your behavior based on imagined monitoring rather than actual requirements. In relationships, identify when you're policing your own emotions or thoughts to avoid conflict, rather than expressing authentic needs. The antidote is conscious visibility. Make deliberate choices about when to be seen and when to be invisible, rather than living in constant anxiety about surveillance. Foucault's most powerful insight was that resistance must be decentralized and interconnected, but not hierarchical. He learned this from studying how the Tunisian resistance survived under extreme surveillance pressure. The key is creating what he called rhizomatic networks connections that spread organically like root systems, where each node can function independently, but draws strength from the whole. If one part is compromised, the network continues functioning. In your personal life, create relationships based on mutual, authentic development rather than social performance or networking. Foucault observed that authentic relationships are nearly impossible for surveillance systems to predict or control because they're based on genuine human connection rather than strategic positioning. Build small circles of trusted people who are committed to actual growth and truth-telling, not just social validation. These relationships become naturally resistant to external manipulation because they're grounded in reality rather than perception management. In your community, focus on direct action and skill sharing rather than political organizing that depends on institutional approval. Foucault saw how the most effective resistance in Tunisia came from students teaching each other practical skills: how to avoid surveillance, how to communicate securely, how to maintain psychological resilience under pressure. Start or join groups focused on developing real capabilities, growing food, learning practical skills, building economic alternatives, creating art that expresses truth rather than conforming to market demands. These activities are inherently resistant to control because they create actual value rather than just symbolic opposition. Online, use the cellular structure in digital spaces. Create small, private groups that coordinate but don't centralize, making your network resilient against algorithmic disruption. Foucault would have understood that social media platforms are designed to make resistance visible and therefore controllable. The most important principle: never make your resistance dependent on platforms or institutions that can be compromised. Build direct relationships that can survive digital censorship, economic pressure, or political persecution. Foucault's Tunisian networks survived because they were based on personal trust and shared commitment to truth, not on any external infrastructure that could be shut down. The most advanced technique: turn surveillance and control systems against themselves. This was Foucault's masterpiece. Insight power systems contain the seeds of their own destruction. If you understand how they actually function, information warfare, instead of trying to avoid algorithmic censorship, flood the system with content that forces it to reveal its biases and contradictions. Foucault taught Tunisian students to overwhelm state surveillance by creating so much activity that authorities couldn't distinguish between real threats and decoys. Create content that appears to comply with platform rules while actually subverting them. Use the algorithm's own logic against itself by understanding exactly what triggers suppression and then finding ways to communicate the same ideas using language and formats the system can't detect. This isn't about deception, it's about exploiting the inherent contradictions in systems designed to control human expression. Every censorship algorithm has blind spots because human creativity will always exceed artificial categorization. Psychological sovereignty: use the state's obsession with monitoring to create space for actual freedom, while surveillance systems are tracking your digital activity. Develop your offline capabilities and relationships that exist outside their reach. Foucault realized that power systems are fundamentally dependent on your attention and participation. The more energy they spend monitoring your decoy activities, the less capacity they have to control your real activities. Create deliberate digital footprints that keep surveillance systems busy with irrelevant data, while you build actual resistance capabilities in spaces they can't monitor. Economic resistance: recognize that your attention, data, and behavioral patterns are the fuel for control systems. Every click, every purchase, Every digital interaction is feeding algorithms designed to predict and manipulate your future behavior. Strategically withdraw your participation from systems designed to exploit you. This doesn't mean becoming a hermit, it means becoming conscious about where you direct your economic and psychological energy. Support businesses and platforms that serve your actual interests rather than extracting value from your dysfunction. Foucault understood that the most powerful form of resistance is simply refusing to participate in systems that require your compliance to function. Every time you choose conscious action over algorithmic manipulation, you're starving the control system of the data it needs to predict and influence others. The advanced application. Learn to recognize the difference between real resistance and performative resistance. Real resistance creates actual alternatives and reduces your dependence on exploitative systems. Performative resistance just feeds the algorithms more data about how to manage dissent. True disciplinary reversal means using their own techniques to become genuinely free, not just to create the appearance of rebellion while remaining fundamentally controlled. Here's what they don't want you to understand. Your individual psychological liberation is inherently political resistance. Every time you refuse to internalize their surveillance, every time you build authentic relationships instead of performing social media personas, every time you choose conscious action over algorithmic manipulation, you're engaging in the same revolutionary activity that Foucault helped coordinate in Tunisia. Personal healing isn't self-improvement, it's warfare against systems that profit from your dysfunction. Individual sovereignty isn't selfishness, it's the foundation of collective liberation. Your refusal to be psychologically controlled is a direct threat to power structures that require your compliance to function. They buried Foucault's revolutionary history because they knew it would give you the exact tools needed to recognize and resist modern control systems. Every technique he developed in those Tunisian resistance cells is applicable to breaking free from algorithmic manipulation, corporate surveillance, and psychological oppression today. The algorithm hides content like this from your feed. Share this before it disappears completely. This information has been suppressed for over 50 years because it's dangerous to those who profit from your psychological imprisonment. Subscribe. Share this video, and save it to your playlists before they classify it as dangerous political content and make it impossible to find. They don't want you comparing notes about these patterns, but that's exactly what we need to do. Your freedom isn't just personal, it's a revolutionary act.